Have you ever noticed how life becomes more elusive the more you try to grasp it with urgency? It's almost as if the act of gripping too tightly causes what you seek to vanish like breath on cold glass. There's a peculiar irony in how we're taught to chase, to push, to control, yet that very pursuit often leads us further away from what we desire. The more you strive to shape every moment to your liking, the more life seems to resist your hands. But this resistance isn't a punishment, it's a redirection, a quiet invitation from something deeper, asking you to consider another way, one that doesn't depend on domination, but on harmony. There's a sacred wisdom that becomes accessible when the noise of struggle quiets down. It reveals itself not in moments of victory, but in pauses. It waits patiently behind the curtain of your urgency, behind every thought screaming that you must act faster, fix more, be stronger. But what if the answers don't live in speed or dominance? What if clarity isn't something you carve out of chaos with effort, but something that arises on its own when you finally step back? Letting go is not the end of participation. It is the beginning of true connection. We often mistake surrender for defeat, imagining it means abandoning hope or walking away from our dreams. But in truth, letting go is not resignation. It's a decision to stop wrestling with what was never meant to be tamed. It is choosing to no longer confuse control with power. You don't stop caring, you stop forcing. In that moment when you release the grip, something gentle begins to stir. A part of you that had long been silenced by the pressure to manage everything begins to breathe again. It doesn't speak in commands, it speaks in soft understanding. It doesn't demand urgency, it extends patience. That part of you is not weak. It's the core of your awareness, calm, clear, untouched by the need to prove anything to anyone. The beauty of surrender lies in its simplicity. It doesn't require an elaborate plan. It only asks for your presence, the type of presence that doesn't rush to escape discomfort, the presence that stays even when there's no certainty, even when things feel unclear, especially then. Because when you stop chasing and begin listening, life doesn't move slower. It becomes more precise. There's a rhythm woven into the universe, one that doesn't scream to be noticed. It pulses quietly beneath everything. That rhythm doesn't respond to desperation. It moves in alignment with clarity, with trust, with inner stillness. But to feel it, you have to step away from the constant internal chatter that insists things must happen on your timeline, under your control. Control masquerades as security, yet its roots are fear. It convinces you that if you just think hard enough, if you plan perfectly, if you anticipate every possibility, you'll finally feel safe. But you won't, because that kind of safety is conditional. It depends on external things going your way, and life isn't built to accommodate every demand. It was never meant to be a battlefield. It was designed as a conversation, and control interrupts that conversation by making it one-sided. There is a kind of knowing that only arrives when you stop trying to predict everything. It doesn't shout over your thoughts. It speaks when your thoughts settle. It doesn't require certainty to function. It thrives in openness. When you move from that place of calm awareness, even your smallest steps carry meaning. You stop moving because you're afraid of missing out. You start moving because the moment calls for you. And only you can answer it the way you were meant to. Letting go of control doesn't mean drifting without purpose. It means no longer dragging yourself toward destinations you outgrew a long time ago. It means recognizing when your energy is being wasted on maintaining illusions instead of building truth. It means acknowledging that some things are not falling apart. They're simply falling away because they no longer belong in your story. When you stop managing every detail, you don't fall into chaos, you rise into clarity. Life starts responding not to your panic, but to your poise. Not to your struggle, but to your sincerity. There is a remarkable difference between action born from alignment and action born from pressure. One leaves you exhausted, the other fills you with quiet strength. Most of us have been conditioned to associate stillness with laziness, to equate rest with weakness. We've been taught that unless we're constantly striving, we're falling behind. But that belief creates a loop of endless effort that leads nowhere. You end up chasing something without ever feeling like you've arrived. Stillness isn't emptiness, it's spaciousness. It's where your real thoughts gather, the ones that aren't shaped by fear or urgency, the ones that know what's right for you. Not because someone told you, but because you felt it deeply and unmistakably. That kind of knowing can't be rushed. It needs room to emerge, and letting go creates that room. You may have believed that success only comes through force, that growth only happens under pressure. But have you noticed how often those paths leave you hollow? You may achieve results, but they don't feel like victories. You reach the goal, but feel no joy. You finish the task, but feel no peace. That's because success that's driven by fear cannot fulfill you. It can only distract you. There is a gentler way, a way that doesn't compromise your well-being for progress, a way that honors your needs without sacrificing your values. But it can only be accessed when you stop resisting what is, when you stop fighting your own life and begin cooperating with it. When you become a listener again, not to the loudest opinions, but to the quiet nudges of your own truth. Letting go reveals that what you feared losing was never what you truly needed. Often, the things we grip most tightly are the things we're most afraid to outgrow. But life has a way of pruning what no longer serves your becoming. And in that pruning, you discover that your worth was never tied to what you could control. It was always found in how you showed up when control slipped away. You don't need to orchestrate every outcome to be okay. You only need to meet each moment as it comes with honesty and openness. You don't need to be prepared for every twist and turn. You only need to trust that whatever you encounter, you'll navigate it better with presence than with panic. The more you lean into trust, the less you rely on force. And the less you rely on force, the more life begins to collaborate with you. Sometimes the reason things aren't working isn't because you're doing too little. It's because you're trying too hard. Your intentions may be pure, but if the energy behind them is rooted in fear, the results will reflect that distortion. Letting go isn't about doing less, it's about aligning better. It's about choosing not to act from anxiety, but from inner coherence. As you start loosening your grip on outcomes, you'll notice something interesting. You'll begin to breathe deeper, your body will soften, your mind will clear. And in that state, new insights will emerge, not forced into being, but rising naturally from a place of readiness. That's not magic. That's what happens when you stop blocking the flow of life with control and allow trust to take its place. Trust is not passive. It doesn't mean waiting for life to fix everything for you. It means engaging with life without demanding it conform to your every preference. It means showing up without needing guarantees. It means doing what's yours to do and leaving space for what's beyond your reach to unfold on its own. That's how real progress is made, not through endless strain, but through right timing and right effort. You might feel uncertain when you let go, and that's okay. Uncertainty is not your enemy. It's simply the space where something new is allowed to begin. When you no longer rush to fill that space with control, you leave room for wisdom to rise. You leave room for unexpected solutions, for graceful pivots, for gentle realignments. And often, those shifts carry more transformation than any rigid plan ever could. In this space of surrender, you learn that you were never meant to carry everything. You were only meant to carry what aligns with who you truly are. And sometimes the greatest act of courage is not in holding on, but in choosing to release. Because in that release, you're not giving up. You're giving way to something wiser, something kinder, something more honest than control could ever offer. There comes a time in your journey when the noise inside grows louder than the world outside. It's not because life has suddenly become more chaotic, but because your soul is signaling that something no longer fits. You begin to feel a quiet discomfort in the places you once felt proud to belong. Tasks that used to excite you begin to drain you. Goals that once lit your fire start to feel like burdens. You're not broken. You're being redirected. And in that redirection, there is a gentle challenge to stop reaching for more just because it's what you've always done, and to begin listening for what truly resonates now. The habit of controlling everything around you is often disguised as responsibility. You might believe it's your job to keep every piece together, to anticipate every need, to solve every problem before it even arrives. But the truth is, the weight you carry is heavier than it was ever meant to be. What if the strength you admire in others wasn't born from constant doing, but from deep trust? Not the kind of trust that expects everything to be perfect, but the kind that remains steady even when things are uncertain. That kind of trust doesn't shrink in the face of the unknown. It expands. It allows you to walk with intention, even when the path isn't clear. It lets you move without panic, because you are no longer trying to control what cannot be controlled. Many people associate trust with naivety. They assume letting go of constant oversight means being careless, but the opposite is true. True trust is a sign of maturity. It requires you to know the difference between what is yours to carry and what is not. It invites you to step out of the exhausting cycle of fixing everything and into a place where you only act when the action is right, not when it's reactive, but when it's aligned. This shift is subtle. It doesn't come with grand declarations. It often begins with a pause, a moment where you choose silence over urgency. That moment is where power begins to change form. Power isn't always about influence or control. Sometimes it's about presence. The kind of presence that sees clearly even in confusion, that stays calm when everything is shifting. When you start trusting the rhythm of your life, you stop measuring yourself against timelines that don't belong to you. You begin to notice how much pressure was created by expectations that were never yours to begin with. Expectations handed down by others, by culture, by outdated versions of who you thought you had to be. Letting go of control helps you reclaim your identity, not as someone shaped by external pressure, but as someone guided by internal alignment. That's where your deepest power lives, not in how tightly you hold the wheel, but in how calmly you adjust when the road changes, not in how well you predict outcomes, but in how gracefully you meet them. It's important to understand that surrender doesn't mean silence in the face of wrong. It doesn't mean giving up your values or compromising what you know is right. It simply means you are no longer fighting against what is. You're choosing to respond from a deeper place, a place that isn't ruled by fear, a place that sees through illusion and understands that sometimes the best way forward is not through resistance but through wisdom. As you begin to soften the urge to direct everything, you start noticing details you used to overlook. The quiet insight that arrives when you stop pushing, the gentle shifts that come when you're not trying to force them. These are the moments where real transformation begins, not because you tried harder, but because you became available to what life was already trying to give you. Think of a river. It flows not because it controls the land, but because it finds the space between the rocks. It moves with grace not by dominating, but by weaving through what is. That's the nature of aligned living. It doesn't deny challenge, but it also doesn't resist every obstacle. It adapts, it learns, it evolves without losing its direction. This is the invitation that life extends to you when you let go of control, to become more fluid, to stop treating discomfort as an enemy and begin seeing it as a teacher. Some of the most profound shifts happen in seasons that look like stillness on the surface, but beneath that calm, everything is changing, roots are deepening, old habits are shedding, inner clarity is forming. And that clarity is more valuable than any forced outcome. You don't have to know the entire path to take the next step. You don't need a guarantee before you begin again. Letting go allows you to take action without anxiety, to move with rhythm instead of resistance, to rise without rushing. The belief that life must be wrestled into cooperation is born from fear. But the more you operate from fear, the more disconnected you become from what truly matters. Fear makes you focus on survival, even when you're safe. It narrows your vision. It rushes your process. It fills your mind with doubt disguised as logic. And in that place, even the right choices feel overwhelming. But when you shift into trust, your mind clears. Not because the challenges disappear, but because you've changed how you relate to them. You're no longer trying to outthink every possibility. You're listening for the next right step. You stop living in the future and you return to now. And now is the only place where peace lives. There's a kind of wisdom that only arrives when you're not striving to earn it. It shows up when you're still enough to hear it. You don't discover it by chasing, but by receiving. This doesn't mean you stop setting intentions. It means your intentions are no longer coated in desperation. They become clean, simple, grounded. And from that grounded place, you begin to live differently. You make decisions without fear of missing out. You say yes only when your whole being agrees. You say no without guilt. Not because you're selfish, but because you finally learned that peace is a priority. And once peace becomes your standard, you stop settling for anything that disrupts it. You stop choosing situations that demand your constant vigilance. You stop chasing people who only love you when you perform. You stop striving to prove your worth through achievement or productivity, because you've come to understand something crucial. Your value is not earned through effort. It is revealed through truth. When you live from alignment instead of urgency, you become a magnet for what's meant for you, not because you forced it to arrive, but because you made space for it to stay. And when something enters your life from a place of clarity, it feels different. It doesn't take from you, it adds to you. It doesn't exhaust your spirit, it supports your growth. This is the paradox of surrender. The more you loosen your grip, the more what's right for you finds its way. Not by accident, but by resonance. Not through struggle, but through synergy. Letting go also reveals what was never truly yours. It shows you where you were trying to make things work that were never in alignment. It doesn't mean those people or places were wrong. It means you've outgrown the version of you that needed them. Growth sometimes means leaving behind what once made you feel secure. And that is not abandonment. That is evolution. You don't need to explain your peace to anyone. You don't have to convince others that your pace is valid. When you're aligned, your energy speaks louder than any words could. You walk into rooms differently. You respond with more calm. You listen more than you defend. You pause before you act. And in that pause, wisdom finds space to land. This kind of life doesn't happen overnight. It's built moment by moment, choice by choice. Every time you choose stillness over reactivity, you reinforce a new way of being, a way that honors your well-being, that respects your limits, that prioritizes your internal world. And when your inner world is whole, Your external world begins to reflect that wholeness. You may find that your relationships shift. Some will grow with you, some will fade. But none of that will scare you because you're no longer trying to hold everything together. You're only holding what holds you back up. You're no longer living in fear of being misunderstood because understanding yourself has become more important. Letting go isn't a single act, it's a daily practice. It's choosing again and again to trust what feels true, even when it's not the easiest path. It's releasing the temptation to manage people's perceptions. It's allowing yourself to exist without constantly editing yourself to fit into what others expect. In that kind of freedom, life begins to bloom, not because you manipulated it into blossoming, but because you nurtured the soil within you. You gave yourself permission to grow without forcing the outcome. You stopped planting seeds with impatience and began tending to them with patience. The shift doesn't need to be loud to be real. It doesn't need to be celebrated to be significant. Sometimes the most meaningful progress is invisible to others, but undeniable to you. It's in the way your breath deepens, in how you sleep more peacefully, in the way your decisions feel lighter. That's how you know the letting go is working. And here's something else you'll realize along the way. Control never gave you what you thought it would. It didn't protect you from pain. It didn't prevent mistakes. It didn't eliminate uncertainty. All it ever did was delay your peace. But the moment you stop waiting for perfect conditions to feel okay, something liberating unfolds. You begin to feel steady, not because everything is fixed, but because you've stopped needing it to be. You become more rooted in your essence and less attached to your circumstances. You trust your own voice more than the noise around you. And from that space, life becomes less about striving and more about flowing. There's something profoundly transformative that happens when you no longer need to orchestrate every detail of your life. When you begin to see that peace isn't a result of perfect conditions, but rather a product of how you choose to engage with what already is, you step into a quieter, more powerful version of yourself. You're no longer fixated on correcting every flaw, chasing every opportunity, or proving yourself at every turn. Instead, you begin to rest not in inactivity, but in alignment. Most people spend years trying to win battles that were never theirs to fight. The pursuit of recognition, the constant internal argument with imagined outcomes, the endless revision of the past in hopes it might finally make sense. These mental habits become like walls within the self, blocking the flow of clarity. But when you step back and stop trying to fix everything, you discover that some of those battles resolve themselves when you simply stop feeding them your energy. You're not meant to carry the entire world on your shoulders. Yet so many internalize the idea that unless they're holding everything together, things will collapse. This weight is silent, often invisible from the outside, but it's there. In the tightened jaw, the restless mind, the hurried breath, and beneath it all, a fear that without this control, nothing will work out. But the truth is, life doesn't need you to be in charge of every moment. It needs you to be in relationship with each moment. There's a difference. One requires you to dominate, the other invites you to cooperate. One is rooted in fear, the other in trust. And trust, when cultivated patiently, becomes your most reliable companion through all stages of life. To trust is not to give up responsibility. It is to understand which responsibilities are truly yours. It is to show up with full presence for what's within your power and to release the rest without guilt. Trust is not passive. It's intentional. It asks you to keep showing up, not because you can control the outcome, but because showing up is who you've chosen to be. This way of living demands a kind of humility that control can't offer. Control pretends to know the answers. Trust is willing to wait for them. Control forces decisions. Trust listens first. Control builds tension. Trust creates space. And in that space, something sacred can finally breathe, your deeper wisdom, your inner balance, your grounded awareness. Letting go doesn't mean abandoning your goals. It means you stop approaching them from a place of scarcity. It means you pursue what matters to you, not because you're afraid of missing your chance, but because it feels meaningful and aligned. You stop chasing what's shiny and start honoring what feels steady. You no longer attach your self-worth to the outcome. Instead, you find value in the way you walk the path. This is where a quieter kind of confidence begins to emerge. Not the loud, attention-seeking confidence that tries to dominate rooms or conversations, but the steady assurance that comes from knowing who you are and trusting where you're headed. Even when it's not visible to anyone else yet, you stop explaining yourself to people who aren't meant to understand. You stop negotiating your peace to gain temporary approval. And in doing so, you reclaim energy that was once scattered across 100 false priorities. The more you let go of the need to control, the more you begin to witness life unfolding on its own terms. Terms that often surprise you with their beauty, their timing, their unexpected grace. The things you once tried to chase begin to appear, not through force but through alignment, not by pushing harder but by becoming more attuned. Control tells you to tighten up when things get hard, but trust teaches you to soften, to breathe into the moment, to allow discomfort to exist without rushing to escape it. Because inside discomfort, there's often a message, not a punishment, but a prompting, an invitation to pay attention, not to fix, but to understand. And when you stop reacting impulsively to every emotional spike, when you stop running from what feels unfamiliar, you begin to hear the truth behind your discomfort. You realize that some of what you called anxiety was simply misalignment, that some of the exhaustion wasn't from doing too much, but from doing things that didn't resonate, that some of the fear was rooted in outdated beliefs that no longer reflect who you're becoming. Letting go of control allows you to see all this, and seeing clearly changes everything. Suddenly you're not in a rush to get somewhere else. You're here, fully present, fully awake to this breath, this step, this choice. And in that presence, life starts to speak in new ways. It doesn't raise its voice, it whispers. And now, for the first time in a long while, you're quiet enough to hear it. The need to micromanage everything fades as you realize how much energy was being spent on protecting yourself from scenarios that never even happened. You notice how much mental space was consumed by preparing for conversations that never took place, defending yourself against judgments that never came, solving problems that were never yours. When you drop those narratives, you reclaim your power, not by seizing it, but by returning it to its rightful place, your present awareness. You were never meant to operate like a machine. You were never designed to function on pressure alone. You are a human being made with rhythm, with emotion, with intuition. And when you begin to honor your design, instead of resisting it, your life begins to feel like yours again. You stop treating rest as a reward and start recognizing it as a necessity. You stop viewing slow days as wasted and begin to see them as sacred. You stop apologizing for needing silence, because silence isn't a lack of productivity, it's a wellspring of insight. Some of the clearest answers arrive not in the noise of doing, but in the quiet of simply being. Letting go invites you to remember that not all growth is visible. Sometimes, the most powerful transformations happen underground, where no one else can see them. In those spaces of uncertainty, when the future hasn't revealed itself yet and the past has lost its grip, you find a deeper part of yourself that was hidden beneath the busyness. That part isn't interested in appearances. It cares only for what's real. That's why letting go is a sacred act. It says, I'm willing to release what's false even if I don't yet know what will take its place. It says, I trust the unfolding, even if it's slower than I'd hoped. It says, I no longer need to hold everything, because I finally believe I am held. And this belief, this inner knowing, is what begins to reshape how you move through the world. You become more discerning with your attention. You stop pouring yourself into people who don't honor your presence. You stop offering explanations to those who've already decided what to believe. You become more selective, not out of arrogance, but out of reverence for your energy. You realize that peace is not found in perfect conditions, but in your relationship to what is. That joy isn't something you chase, but something you allow. That clarity isn't something you earn, but something that arises when you stop filling every moment with noise. And so, the more you surrender the illusion that everything must go according to plan, the more you discover that the plans life had for you were often better than the ones you created. Not because they were easier, but because they were truer. They required more presence, more patience, more trust, but they also brought more depth, more alignment, more meaning. Letting go allows you to see clearly what was never yours to begin with. The timelines that suffocated you, the expectations that boxed you in, the labels that kept you small. When those fall away, you begin to remember who you were before the pressure to be someone else. You reconnect with a version of yourself that's steady, that's aware, that doesn't need to impress because she's finally accepted her worth. That's when things start to shift, not just in your inner world, but in your outer reality. The conversations become more honest. The relationships become more mutual. The days feel less like a race and more like an offering. You're not dragging yourself through the week. You're moving with clarity, with steadiness, with purpose. This is what surrender really means. Not giving up, but giving in to what's right for you. It means choosing your path, not by default, but by design. Not because you're trying to escape discomfort, but because you're choosing not to create unnecessary pain. It means letting go of urgency and walking instead with devotion. And the more you walk this way, the more you see how much beauty was always around you. You were just moving too fast to notice. You start to taste the sweetness in small moments. You start to feel grateful, not for what might happen someday, but for what's already here. You realize that life's most profound gifts aren't wrapped in achievement, but in awareness. You stop measuring progress by how much you produce and begin to feel progress in how grounded you remain when things are uncertain. You stop looking for external validation because your sense of worth no longer depends on someone else's understanding. And this quiet shift that no one else may see changes everything. Letting go isn't a sign of weakness, it's evidence of wisdom. It shows that you've come to understand what truly deserves your attention and what never did. It means you've decided to stop arguing with reality and start flowing with it. And from that decision, a deeper kind of freedom begins to emerge. Not the freedom to do whatever you want, but the freedom to be fully present with whatever comes. There comes a quiet moment when you realize that everything you were running toward was never meant to be chased, only received. And that realization doesn't arrive with a dramatic shift, but in a stillness that feels sacred. A soft recognition that life is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be embraced, moment by moment, breath by breath. The grasping fades, the rushing quiets, and you finally begin to see clearly. What belongs to you will meet you, not through force, but through your willingness to be ready. You begin to understand that trust isn't something you practice only when things go well. It's something you lean on when nothing makes sense, when the pieces don't fit and the path seems uncertain. It's in those times, especially those times, that your depth is revealed. Because anyone can pretend to have faith when the way is clear. But it's in the ambiguity, the unknown, the waiting, that true surrender is forged. There's a maturity that blooms when you no longer beg life to move faster, when you no longer resist its natural rhythm or try to reshape what has already been written. Instead, you find yourself breathing deeper, listening more intently, choosing your responses with care. You're not reacting out of fear anymore. You're no longer controlled by the anxiety of missing your moment, because something inside you has shifted. You now understand the things meant for you are not fragile. They don't require panic. They arrive when you're prepared, not when you're desperate. Control tries to convince you that constant vigilance will protect your peace, but the truth is, control destroys the very serenity you're trying to safeguard. You become consumed by the need to anticipate, to predict, to intervene before something can go wrong. And yet the very things you fear often emerge not because life is against you, but because you've been out of step with your own balance. Letting go doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop pretending you can manage every moving part. It's a sacred recognition that life has wisdom beyond your reach, and you don't need to supervise it for it to unfold with grace. You don't have to script every moment for it to be meaningful. In fact, some of the most beautiful things that ever happen come unplanned. They arise when you're open, when your heart is unclenched, when your mind stops racing long enough for stillness to speak. There is a current that runs beneath all things, a silent, steady rhythm that guides the unfolding of events with more precision than your best strategies ever could. When you resist it, life feels like a storm. But when you begin to align with it, the chaos quiets, not because challenges disappear, but because your posture has changed. You're no longer gripping, you're opening. Opening is an act of courage. It requires you to show up without guarantees, to speak without rehearsing, to love without conditions, to live without pretending. And that level of vulnerability feels risky, especially in a world that prizes certainty. But it's only through that openness that life can reach you fully. You start to notice that the more you release, the more you receive, not in quantity, but in quality. You no longer fill your time with distractions. You no longer accept anything that costs you your center. You no longer reach for things that make you abandon yourself. Because peace has become your standard. And once peace becomes your standard, anything that disturbs it becomes obvious. Letting go teaches you what actually nourishes you. You begin to feel the difference between what lifts you and what drains you, between what fills your soul and what merely fills your schedule. You stop glorifying being busy. You stop believing that being exhausted is a badge of honor. And you start making decisions that leave you feeling alive instead of depleted. This doesn't mean your life becomes perfect. It means you stop expecting perfection to feel whole. You stop needing external confirmation to trust your direction. You stop asking everyone else for permission to choose what resonates. You no longer look outside of yourself for validation that can only ever come from within. You become more gentle, not just with others, but with yourself. You stop judging your pace. You stop punishing yourself for things you didn't know then. You stop demanding results on timelines that weren't yours to begin with. And in that gentleness, something miraculous happens. Growth accelerates, not because you're doing more, but because you're doing what matters. Presence becomes your practice, integrity becomes your compass, and joy becomes less about pleasure and more about peace. You begin to notice the wind on your skin again. You begin to hear the sincerity in someone's laughter. You begin to feel time slowing down, not because the clock changed, but because you did. This shift rewires everything. You no longer chase moments. You become a vessel that welcomes them. You don't grip love so tightly it suffocates. You allow love to breathe, to be, to deepen without pressure. You don't overthink every conversation. You trust your words when they're honest, your silence when it's needed. You don't rehearse life, you show up for it. And slowly, the fear that used to control you starts to fade. Not because it disappears, but because it's no longer driving your decisions. You still feel it sometimes, it's natural. But now you meet it with presence, you greet it with wisdom. You acknowledge it without letting it lead. And this is what it means to live from within rather than from reaction. Letting go reveals a surprising truth. You never needed to perform to be loved. You never needed to be perfect to be accepted. You never needed to sacrifice your peace for someone else's comfort. You only needed to be yourself, fully, authentically, unapologetically. The right people, the right opportunities, the right moments, they respond to the real you, not the curated version you created to survive. And here's something even more profound. What you release will often return, but only when it's meant for you. Sometimes what feels like a loss is just space being made for a deeper return. Sometimes what feels like an ending is just the clearing required for a beginning that actually fits, but you can only receive what's real when your hands are not clinging to what's not. That's why surrender is the most powerful decision you can make. It reclaims your energy. It reorients your vision. It rewrites your relationship with time. No longer in a race against the clock, you begin to trust that you are exactly where you need to be, that nothing delayed you, that every twist in the road had a reason, even if you can't see it yet. Letting go doesn't mean you won't have moments of doubt. It means you won't let those moments define your direction. It doesn't mean you don't care. It means you care enough to walk in truth instead of fear. It doesn't mean you sit back and wait passively. It means you participate with full presence and release the need to predict outcomes. Because control is always about the future. It's about trying to outwit time. But trust lives in the present. It says, "This moment is enough. I am enough. And whatever comes next, I will meet it from this rooted place." You begin to cultivate a kind of wealth that isn't measured in numbers. It's found in how calm your mornings feel, in how deeply you can listen, in how gently you respond to the unexpected, in how freely you can laugh, not because life is flawless, but because your heart is light. And in that lightness, your direction becomes clearer. You make decisions not to escape, but to expand. You take risks, not because you're afraid to stand still, but because you trust where your feet land. You start walking, not to chase something missing, but to honor something present. The things you used to beg for begin to arrive without struggle, not because life owes you, but because you're finally a match for what you were always meant to receive. And when it comes, you don't cling. You hold it with care, with reverence, but never with desperation. Because you know that what flows with peace stays with ease. This isn't luck. This is alignment. This is what happens when you make space for grace to enter. When you stop blocking the current with doubt and start moving with the quiet certainty of someone who knows they are already whole. You are no longer asking life to prove anything. You are participating with gratitude, with openness, with humility. And in this posture, life becomes less about controlling outcomes and more about honoring the journey. There is no need to perform your piece, no need to make it look a certain way. It doesn't need validation. It doesn't need to be explained. Real peace speaks for itself. It radiates from how you show up, how you breathe, how you love, how you let things go when they no longer serve you. And when peace becomes your compass, you stop getting lost in the chaos. You stop trying to be everywhere at once. You stay grounded in your present place, not stuck, but steady, not stagnant, but deeply connected. From that place, everything changes, not all at once, but steadily, quietly, beautifully. You begin to see that letting go was never about weakness. It was always about wisdom. It was never about surrendering your power. It was about remembering where your true power comes from. Not from force, not from pressure, not from performance, but from presence. And so you walk forward, not in a rush, not to prove anything, but because you found a rhythm that feels honest, a rhythm that doesn't exhaust you, a rhythm that lets life breathe through you. You trust the pauses, you honor the unfolding, you meet the day with calm, the night with gratitude, the unknown with openness. And in doing so, you live not in fear of what could go wrong, but in peace with what is going right. Because now you understand, life doesn't require your control. It only asks for your attention, your honesty, your willingness to listen. And in the end, that's what makes everything work. Not your grip, but your grace.